What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you what Pathfinder 2nd Edition could bring to video games. So first things first, I will have timestamps down in the description below, as I imagine this is going to be a bit on the lengthy side, at least for my videos. Right at the beginning, I do want to thank Paizo for actually providing me with the core rulebooks for Pathfinder and Starfinder, which, by the way, I'll be doing a similar video for the Starfinder franchise, Pathfinder's sister game. But Paizo actually provided me with the core rulebooks for both of these titles, and to give a bit of background on that in what I can only describe as impeccable timing, a couple days before I was actually planning on just buying the rulebooks for myself, Paizo actually reached out to my business email as they had noticed that a lot of people watching Pathfinder content on YouTube actually watched my channel, and they were kind enough to provide me with their official review copy request channels, as well as mentioning that if I needed any help with anything, feel free to ask, that kind of thing. And I was like, well, funny you should mention, I'm actually literally about to start working on these two videos. Here's the concept, and again, they were kind enough to provide me with the core rulebooks for these titles, so I could make them, so thank you to Paizo. To give some basic structure to what we're going to be covering here, first I'm going to be talking about why I'm talking about this, as well as the current state of when and if we might ever get a Pathfinder 2E game. Then I'm going to talk about Pathfinder 2E as a whole and its place in the market a little bit. And then from there, I'm going to take aspects of the Pathfinder 2E system that are changed or drastically altered from 1st edition and talk about how they could be implemented into a video game. Because if you're unaware, we already have two 1st edition Pathfinder games via Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous. But Pathfinder 2E is a relatively new system that has not seen a video game yet, as it only released in 2019. But first up, let's talk about why I'm talking about this a little bit. So, my channel, as you might imagine, focuses on video games, but more specifically, I really love to cover CRPGs, which are what Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous are. Isometric CRPGs are a personal favorite of mine, and while I haven't played all of them, I have played most of them, or at least most of the big ones. Fallout 1, 2, Baldur's Gate 1, 2, Tyranny, Pillars of Eternity 2, you name it, I've probably played it and reviewed it, as well as made guides for them in some cases. So as you might imagine, this subject is something important to me because a quality of isometric CRPGs is that they tend to be based off of a tabletop role-playing system, which is of course what Pathfinder 2nd Edition is. It's the 2nd edition of the Pathfinder tabletop rule set. That said, let's talk about Pathfinder 2E a little broadly. I will actually try to link a video down below that I think discusses this topic very, very well, but I'm going to kind of give you the spark notes here. If you're unaware, Pathfinder 2E has received a slightly frosty reception. And while some people certainly don't like it, reality is most of the people who play it very much so enjoy it. That said, even the people who play Pathfinder 1E really aren't playing 2nd edition that much, so why is that? Well, basically, Pathfinder 1st edition came about because the people who were playing Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition did not want to move on to D&D 4th edition, which most people hated. Paizo, who actually worked for Dungeons & Dragons at the time, printing a magazine full of adventures and stuff, eventually separated from Dungeons & Dragons and used their OGL, I believe it was, license to create the Pathfinder system, which was based on D&D 3.5. So all of the people who were playing D&D 3.5 who didn't want to move on to 4th edition, but had no further content being made for it, moved over to Pathfinder. In fact, Pathfinder, the 1st edition, was so successful at this time, in the face of 4th edition's, let's be honest, failure, that Pathfinder 1E actually outsold Dungeons & Dragons for many years. However, Dungeons & Dragons has had a bit of a renaissance with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which is easily the most popular tabletop role-playing game of all time so far. Now, in a very interesting case here, Paizo, I wouldn't say repeated a mistake because in general people tend to be a lot more receptive of Pathfinder 2E quality-wise, whereas most people just hated 4th edition. But nonetheless, Paizo repeated what Dungeons & Dragons did, which is that they moved away from 3.5 to make a new edition of their system. And as such, the people who moved from Dungeons & Dragons to play Pathfinder based on 3.5 now, quite frankly, don't want to move on to 2nd edition. Which is fair, because at this point they've spent many years collecting all of the materials for 3.5. I can get why there would be some resistance there. But I will mention that 2nd edition Pathfinder still retains the core pillars of what 3.5 was, while making a lot of great changes. And the entire point of this video, of course, is to discuss those changes, at least the bigger in scope changes. We're not going to get super granular here. And moreover, what this system could then bring to the video game space, which all use adaptations of these rule sets. Now, before we jump into the big changes, broadly speaking, I think 2nd edition is easier to play than 1st edition Pathfinder or D&D 3.5, which is incredibly rules heavy, which is still honestly a bit true for 2nd edition as well. But 2E really sought to streamline a lot of the process and make things easier, as well as make some, in my opinion, great changes to the rules. Now, probably the biggest overhaul was combat itself, but we'll get to that. And while, again, for the people who really love 3.5 and 1st edition Pathfinder, I can see why they wouldn't like some of this stuff, but broadly speaking, I think all of these changes actually make lower level characters more interesting and able to do more things, while also being easier to play a little bit. Now, late game, I think it winds up being about the same with the number of feats and everything. My initial impression was that the late game would be a little worse for wear, so to speak, with 2nd edition, because in 1st edition, you could make a full attack with a max level character and make like 10 or 11 attacks in some cases, where that isn't quite the same thing in Pathfinder 2E. But from here, let's actually talk about some of these changes. And we're going to start with ability scores, because in my opinion, that is one of the building blocks of what a TTRPG is. So ability scores are your things like strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Now, for the most part, this is exactly the same with some minor tweaks. However, they've kind of balanced all of this out compared to 1st edition. So now, every character you make basically starts with 10 in every stat. And then, through a combination of their ancestry, which is like the new version of a race choice, that character's background, as well as their class pick, they get what are called boosts to their stats. These are a +2 bonus to a particular stat. They can be either a set bonus, where the bonus has to go to like strength or something in particular based on their class, or it can be a free ability bonus, which means you get to assign it. However, if you have more than one at a time, you can't assign it to the same stat at the same time. Moreover, another rule for 2E is that at level 1, a character cannot have a stat or ability score higher than 18. So for character creation, again, you start with 10. You can take a flaw for a benefit type of bonus thing as well, which would let you take a -2 to a ability score to take a +2 somewhere else. That's a thing, but for the most part, everyone's going to start with 10 in every ability score, and then based on the boosts given from their ancestry, their background, and their class, they're going to apply all of these bonuses to their various appropriate stats, and then you get your character. Now, this is a very balanced way to approach it. While a video game could easily just quickly do this math for you, on paper, I can see how that would be a little confusing. So because of that, there is still very much so in 2E a dice roll option. And while there isn't specifically a point-buy system, you could do a point-buy system if you really wanted to, where you simply say, this is how many stats you have, assign them appropriately, they can't be over 18, typically they wouldn't be below 8 either, and you could also do it that way. But another big change that I want to talk about with ability scores is that now each class has a key ability, which in some cases was pretty much the case anyway. Like for instance, if you're playing a barbarian, you're probably going to want to go into strength. However, for Pathfinder 2E, I think this affects spellcasters more so than anyone else, because their spellcasting ability is important to them, because in 1st edition, every spellcaster, for the most part, basically needed dexterity. This was because anytime a spellcaster shot a ranged projectile, that was considered a ranged attack, and they had to make a ranged attack roll, which required dexterity for you to be good at it. However, that's been done away with in 2E. Your key ability stat for that caster class is now what you would use in place of that, which I think is fantastic, as they can make what is known as a spell attack. With a spell attack now as part of the 2E system, typically speaking, that will use the spellcaster's key ability instead of like dexterity. So whereas a normal attack roll would be a d20 plus strength or dexterity if it was a melee or ranged attack, plus their proficiency bonus, plus anything else after that, a spell attack would, instead of using strength or dexterity, would use the caster's ability modifier. But we'll talk a bit more about proficiencies here shortly, but just know that in general, spellcasters benefit greatly from key abilities. Now let's move on to Ancestries Ancestries a little bit. Ancestries have basically replaced the race choice by picking an ancestry followed by a heritage. Now, my initial reaction to this system was that it was a bit strange, frankly. So a lot of this still works the same way. You pick an ancestry, which is typically, for the most part, the races that you are familiar with, human, elf, dwarf, etc. But then you pick a heritage. A heritage defines the bonus a little bit that you get from your ancestry. So your ancestry will typically give you a bonus, in some cases a minus to your ability scores, as well as potentially other benefits like dark vision, etc. Heritages will affect exactly what you're gaining from the chosen ancestry, which acts as your race. Heritages now also include things that used to be races. So if in your past your family convorted with demons, or you have some association with celestial beings, which would make you a tiefling or an Aasimar respectively, which used to be referred to as races, are now heritages in this system. And they fall under what is called a versatile heritage. So when you're picking an ancestry, you could pick human or elf, and then pick the versatile heritage of tiefling or Aasimar, etc., and that's how you would become that thing. And as such, this system actually allows you to be like a human tiefling, or any other manner of ancestry, as they're now called, who comes into being that way. Now, overall, I think that is a pretty interesting way to handle it that I think actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And then in addition to those things, we still get to pick our background, and will typically also affect skills and feats as well. And then, of course, we pick our class, which determines our key ability score, like we talked about, as well as some other ability boosts, which is where I want to talk about feats. Pathfinder 2E is very heavy on feats. There are ancestry feats, class feats, and general feats, so you'll be picking feats pretty often. But this is especially important to know because multiclassing as well as archetypes have been rolled into class feats. Ancestry and general feats are pretty much what you would expect them to be. They just add some variation and options to what you're going with. But I think the class feats are especially important because of their emphasis on the multiclassing and the archetypes. So in 1E, you would pick an archetype, typically at character creation when you chose that class or when you multiclassed into it. You would pick a specific archetype for that class while you were at it. And archetypes usually fundamentally change how a class plays in some way by trading off a class feature for something else. Well, now, starting at second level, this is where you would pick a class feat that would then kind of give you that archetype. And then later on, when you pick more class feats, and this is how you pick your archetypes. Now, typically this would happen at level 2, because that's when you get your first class feat, but it's still possible to do it at level 1 if you really wanted to, or if it changed how your class played in some specific way. So from a game standpoint, this might work much in the way it works now, where you pick the class archetype at level 1, and then you're just forced to take the feat at level 2, for instance. They could still make this a character creation choice if they wanted to. And the core rulebook for Pathfinder 2E even specifically mentions that you can do this. Now, much more interesting is the multiclassing. So multiclassing works fundamentally differently in 2nd edition than it did in Pathfinder 1st edition and 3.5. So 1st edition used what I like to think of as sort of a level up point system, where every time you leveled up, you essentially earned a class point, and you would put that point into whatever class you wanted to, and this is how you would multiclass. So long as you met the prerequisites to be that class, you could spread out your levels all over the place this way, which is largely how it works in 1st edition as well as both of the Pathfinder games as well. However, in 2nd edition, we also do this through our class feats. So in order to multiclass, you would use a class feat to pick the dedication feat for another class. This is going to give you the most basic aspects of that second class. And then with further class feats, you could actually continue taking more and more feats from that class, which would give you more and more of its class features, etc. And while this way you wouldn't be nearly as good with each individual class, you could still effectively play both. Now, I like this a great deal simply because I think it makes things a bit simpler, especially for newcomers to the game, because min-maxing and multiclassing, etc. was a huge deal, especially in the video games, where that was honestly just a large part of it, was min-maxing your character with dips into other classes. And while it's cool to min-max every once in a while, a lot of times you could end up with a class that just didn't make any sense because it would actually be like 3 or 4 different classes that weren't even remotely related to each other. Whereas this system, using these dedication feats to multi-class, still provides the same basic function while being, frankly, just easier to manage from a balance standpoint. Now, from here, I want to talk about proficiencies. So, gone are the days in 2nd edition of the base attack bonus, or armor or weapon proficiencies in the way that we used to think about them. So in 1st edition, being proficient with armor or weapons basically just meant you could use them, whereas proficiencies in 2nd edition work much differently. So first of all, there is no base attack bonus as you level up. What you have is a proficiency bonus. These bonuses range from untrained to legendary. If you are untrained in something, you gain no benefit for using it. You can still use it in most cases, but you can't actually gain any benefit from it in terms of a proficiency bonus. However, if you are trained in something, you get a +2 proficiency bonus when using it. And this goes all the way up to legendary, which provides a +8 bonus to using it. So now, when your character makes an attack roll to decide whether or not they hit the target, they would roll a d20 plus their strength modifier for a melee attack, or dexterity for a finesse weapon or a ranged attack, and then they would add their proficiency bonus instead of their base attack bonus to the roll. And this, of course, then goes up against the target's AC, which they may or may not have a proficiency bonus in. Now, this change to base attack bonus also pretty greatly affects how you make attacks and everything per round, but we'll get to that. And then these proficiency bonuses also tend to be the prerequisite for taking a feat or something. So in order to take a certain feat, you might need to be trained or an expert or a master of this particular proficiency to then pick up an associated feat. So that's something to keep in mind as well, as these proficiency bonuses that you get from your class are pretty important, and it's important to know how big that bonus is by your class being trained or an expert in it, etc., which provides a 2, 4, 6, or 8 bonus to the proficiency roll, which overall I think is a much simpler system than the base attack bonus stuff, as well as just simplifying a lot of the math, which was my key takeaway from the character creation portions of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, is that it is honestly just easier to get somebody into the game here, as they've streamlined a lot of the more complicated rules, or at the very least just made them a bit simpler. Like, they toned down the math required in a lot of cases. The changes to a caster's key abilities becoming what they use for their spell attack, making a lot more sense than using dexterity most of the time, which in terms of a video game I think would absolutely make character creation much simpler. As someone who plays a ton of CRPGs, etc., and more specifically for Pathfinder Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous, one of the biggest complaints you'll see people make about those two games, or at least new players anyway, is that they have a very hard time figuring out character creation because it just throws tons of information at them all at once, and they don't necessarily know about the decisions they're making. Whereas with the Pathfinder 2e system, I think it is infinitely easier to make a character, and it would be much easier to present this in a way that would be simpler for people to understand, while simultaneously, I think, leaving a bit less room for bugs, as that is another big complaint that you'll see in the Pathfinder titles, is that they tend to be very buggy. And one of the reasons I think that is because, quite frankly, all the different class interactions. In the tabletop version, it's very easy to go, here's how these classes are supposed to interact. But when you have to code that into a video game across 30 plus classes, I think it leaves a lot of room for error. So with the Pathfinder 2e system, I think the main takeaways for character creation are that it would be vastly simpler for new players, along with quite possibly being much less buggy than it sometimes is with first edition. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are skills. These work quite a bit differently in 2e as well. So for starters, the actual skills themselves have changed. Now, rather than put points into skills like first edition, you will actually use your proficiency bonus here as well. Depending on your class and your background, etc., you'll be trained to some level in a certain amount of skills, which means you get to add the appropriate proficiency bonus when using that skill. Skills also have an ability modifier associated with them, so if you're using acrobatics, for instance, that's dexterity, or if you're trying to lie or talk your way out of something, that is, of course, charisma. So the way you get your skill modifier now is the modifier from the key ability that you're using. So if you have an 18 in something, that would be a +4 modifier, plus the proficiency bonus depending on your training in that skill, and any other bonuses you might have, and then that becomes your skill modifier. However, when you are attempting a skill check, you basically just roll a d20 and then add your skill modifier, which is again the skill's key ability score plus its proficiency bonus plus whatever you rolled on your d20, and that's how you make your skill checks now, as opposed to your skill modifier being points that you were putting into your skills in 1st edition. Now, overall, I think this makes this a bit simpler, as again, this boils it down to the proficiency bonus at the same time, while still retaining the dice check, so simply by using feats or something to increase your level of proficiency bonus in a particular skill, or simply by increasing the associated ability modifier, you'll then get better at that skill, which again is just one of the cases where they're simplifying the math a little bit. Now, another thing about skills is that all of them have actions associated with them. They have untrained actions and trained actions. Skills are something that in order to do certain things with them, you are required to be trained at them, which means having a proficiency bonus of some sort. Whereas if you're untrained, there still might be a few things you can do, but typically speaking, these are less. Now, in this particular case, with a list of untrained and trained actions, I think a video game could make great use of turning skills into a sort of skill menu, if you will, where you can bring up a skill and then pick associated actions such as grappling, jumping, shoving, that kind of stuff for like, say, athletics, or a trained action like treating disease or poison with the medicine skill, which basically means I think that a video game could turn this into a more actively used system than the rather passive system, if you will, that it is often used as in the 1st edition rule set, where a lot of these skill checks just happen either by clicking on a lock or something and it just does the dice roll for you and you succeed or fail. Whereas 2E's skill system, I think, could be a little more active and engaging if it was brought into the game in that way, which is something that I think, depending on, of course, the adventure path used or a variety of other factors, such as, frankly, the player's engagement, could make the skill system from 2E very, very engaging, as opposed to 1st edition's very passive approach, in my opinion. Though, to be fair, it could still work basically the same way as it does in Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous now, but my point is there's potential for a more active system here, which I would personally love to see. But before we move on from skills, the last thing I want to mention is skill feats. These are, of course, feats related to your skills. These are actually a subtype of general feats, so when you're picking your general feats, you might also be picking a skill feat here, but sometimes you'll see the rules and stuff refer to a skill feat, which again is merely a subtype of the general types of feats. Now, let's talk combat a little bit here. Combat hands down saw the biggest overhaul to the system, frankly. So where 1st edition used a move and an action system, 2nd edition uses a 3-action system, essentially. So 1st edition, you could move whatever your base speed amount was, and then you could take a standard action and attack, etc., or make a full attack, that type of stuff. Whereas in 2nd edition, what you essentially have is a 3-action point system, where you get 3 actions, reactions, and then of course any free actions that you might be able to make. Now, reactions still work basically the same way, though they change some of the rules around them, like attacks of opportunity actually require you to have a feat that lets you do it now. Some martial classes might pick this up pretty early actually, but like a wizard would have to go out of their way to get the feat, for instance. And then from there we have our 3 action points. You use these for everything that you do. If you want to move, you can use 1 action point to move your entire base speed amount, and then if you want to go farther, you have to spend another action. This is called the stride action, which basically just means move. There are other types of movement governed by this, such as climbing, etc., having its own sort of action, which is important for the tabletop section, but for a video game, it would pretty much calculate that for you, is what I'm getting at. But you also use these action points to attack and cast your spells. Now, unlike 1st edition, there's not really like a full attack option. You can't just attack something like 11 times at max level in a row with your 1 standard action. It doesn't really work that way now. You spend 1 action point to attack, however you have 3 of them. So if you're standing next to an enemy, you could conceivably attack 3 times even at level 1. Now, spellcasting, I think, is especially interesting with this system, as the amount of action points used to cast your spells, etc., changes drastically. A lot of spells cost 2 action points, which will allow you to move and then cast a spell like normal. or at least normal for first edition, or you could use all of your action points to cast spells that turn. In fact, some feats for spellcasters in particular will modify the amount of action points required to use each spell. And in fact, some spells can even benefit from spending a varying amount of your action points, such as Magic Missile. So at level 1, you'll actually only shoot one Magic Missile if you only use one action point. However, if you cast it as a level 1 spell and use all 3 action points, then you get 3 missiles. However, if you cast it in a higher level spot, you actually get an additional missile for each action you spend, which will result in a much stronger spell later on, actually, as opposed to the one additional missile per spell slot like first edition uses. So there's a lot of interesting interactions, especially with the spell system around this 3-action system, that I think could make a video game incredibly engaging. Because whereas now the games actually use like the meta magic stuff in a menu to kind of adjust a lot of this, I think it would be very cool to use this system in combat, like actively choosing the amount of action points your spellcasters are spending to cast their spells, messing around with the feats to change how this works. Meta magic is still a thing. You can just cast something as a higher level spell slot, for instance, to make it heightened. But the core system of using spell slots and varying spell levels for each class still remains the same, which is why for combat, I think this particular action point system that they use here makes the lower levels of the game much more engaging, as you can do a lot more at a lower level. And at the higher level, because of the feats you're getting that will affect the amount of actions or the actions spent when you use things, as well as what you can do when you take your actions, ultimately makes the in-game still pretty engaging as well. But before we move on, I want to talk a little more about spellcasting. So spellcasting, in addition to the things I've already mentioned, actually got grouped up a little differently. So in first edition, you basically had Divine Magic, Arcane Magic, or Untyped. Untyped was a rarity, but it did come up occasionally. Well, in second edition, you have Arcane, Divine, Primal, and Occultist. So like a druid would get the primal spell tradition, which are what these types of magic, if you will, are. Now, this is a relatively minor thing, but I wanted to mention it because I think it makes spellcasting make a lot more sense, because rather than these rather complicated spell books that use different types of magic in all these different cases, I think this particular system simplifies a lot of that by simply making different types of magic for some of the more interesting classes. Like in first edition, druids technically use divine magic, whereas now it's primal magic, which I think makes more sense, and also helps differentiate it from the types of spells a cleric is casting, which was also divine magic, which was just a little weird. Now, all of that said, that is the big important stuff that I think changed from second edition to first edition. But I do think it's worth mentioning that there are a lot of other tiny rules that I think are great changes from first edition to second edition. However, I would tell you from a game standpoint, the chances of you seeing them probably wouldn't be a thing. For instance, in second edition, there is an option to retrain your characters or change out their feats, etc., basically, when your characters are resting. Resting still mostly works the same way, by the way. But in a video game, you would probably just still go to an NPC to retrain your character, and maybe some time would pass, but that would be about it. So from a game perspective, that rule wouldn't really change much, but it is something second edition actually allows you to do in the tabletop version. Other examples of this are like the Raise Shield ability. This might be turned into a toggle rather than something you have to do every turn, because in Pathfinder 2E, there's a whole mechanic around using an action to actually raise your shield to gain the AC bonus from it. There's also an item damage system that I don't think would probably be implemented into a game, as a lot of people don't like that, and it hasn't been the case up to this point, so I don't think adding in the item damage system from the tabletop version would make a lot of sense for a video game. One other rule that I wanted to mention in this particular regard, because I think it's actually quite important to video game balance, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, if you make an attack on a target and your attack roll exceeds the target's AC by more than 10, which is their defense roll basically, their armor class, if you outroll their armor class by 10 or more, you immediately crit the target, which means extra damage, of course. Well, in a video game, I'm not sure if that would translate well, simply because video games allow for a lot of min-maxing, and a rule like that would in all likelihood make it quite easy to almost guarantee criticals in a closed system that doesn't have an actual GM like a video game would. So a rule like that, I think, would have to be implemented very, very specifically to not be immediately abused and run the game into the ground, basically. But overall, let's wrap this thing up, as I have been going on for quite some time. To recap, I think Pathfinder 2nd Edition would be a fantastic fit for a video game, and if anybody over at Paizo actually watches this, you should absolutely push to get a video game going in 2nd Edition of the quality of Kingmaker or Wrath of the Righteous, because I think you'd have a great chance to have a hit on your hand, because the character creation would be a bit easier. In fact, there are arguably more choices, while still retaining all of the systems that people like myself love, such as the ability scores and modifiers, while simultaneously balancing some of it out and making it easier to approach with things like the multiclassing and the archetypes, etc. I also think there's huge potential for the skill system if it's implemented properly. I think that could be very engaging, as we don't see too many active skills, so to speak, in these types of games these days anymore. And then the combat system in particular, I think, could be incredibly engaging if you ported it into a video game, especially, again, for spellcasters, because I think balancing out how you're spending those actions to attack, etc., could make for some very interesting gameplay. As a question I've fielded on this channel before is how to build a caster early game in like Wrath of the Righteous when they're very weak, because they only get one action per turn and they really don't get a lot of spells to use. So the extra actions there could really help out characters in that position. And because of some of the systems in place, like capping the ability scores at 18 at character creation or level 1, helping kind of tone down some of the min-maxing, especially with like the multi-classing that gets very over the top in Wrath of the Righteous, I think would be fantastic for making a slightly easier to approach video game that retained basically all of the complexity at the same time, which I think would be very, very cool. But there you go, guys. There is my full thoughts on what Pathfinder 2nd Edition could bring to the video game space, and I, for one, am certainly hoping that we get a video game made with this particular rule set, as I think it would be fantastic. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. And if you're interested in Starfinder at all, stay tuned. I will have a very similar video for that particular rule set as well, which is Pathfinder's sister game. So really hope you enjoyed it. Leave any feedback down below, anything you feel I may have missed, etc. By all means, make it a conversation down below. I'd love to read through all that stuff. But more than anything, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.